Did you know there are some things that are even more important than the panels themselves, the battery, or even the sunshine when choosing whether or not to go solar? I had a system installed in my house here in the UK just over a year ago, and I've been through the full process. So here are the 9 things that I wish I had known before getting started, beginning with the installation process. First thing that you'll need is a smart meter. Most people have these days, but the energy company that you go with ultimately will require you to have one of these if you want to export your energy to the grid. And this is because they need to figure out actually how much energy you are putting out. And so they need to be able to read the meter every 30 minutes, which is what a smart meter allows you to do. Once that's sorted, you can start the survey process. So that basically means getting somebody around to your house, and that's either from a solar panel company directly, which is what I did, or you can get somebody third party and independent who doesn't have a financial incentive to sell you a panel system. What they will do is they will come to your house and they will look at your rooftop and they will look up there and say, okay, well, what angle and orientation actually is it? How many panels do we think we can fit up there? And what's kind of the yield that you're going to get from that? But more importantly, they'll look at your usage and decide with you how many panels you actually need, because there's no point getting a ton of panels if you're not actually going to use them, because there's going to be a massive cash outlay at the beginning and it's going to take a long time to pay off. If you're a heavy user of electricity, there's also an element of permissions. There is the DNO. This is the distribution network operator who actually manage the grid around you. For me, it is actually the national grid, but it depends on where you're in the country as to who your DNO is going to be. And every solar installation that's going to export to the grid directly needs to have a sign off or approval or fit within the guidelines from the DNO in order to actually export back to the grid, because they are ultimately the ones that are receiving that energy physically. They're not the ones that will pay you, but they manage the infrastructure. For example, on my house, I couldn't have bigger than a 6 kilowatt system, because unless you're running a business or something at home that is using a lot of that energy internally, then the sign off just wasn't going to be given for that amount of export. I think there's partly a worry about cabling, about sending too much energy down the cable and breaking something, for example. So once you have everything sorted out and you know what kind of panel system you're looking for, that's the point at which you're going to start getting some quotes for these things, because you've got a cost for the panels, you've got a cost for the inverter, which is the piece of machinery that takes the energy from the solar panels and turns it into usable energy within the house. Solar panels produce DC and the house uses AC electricity, so that needs to be converted, and that happens in the inverter. And then you also may or may not be going for a battery as well, depending on your use case and how you're going to interact with the system. Once you've picked a quote amongst the providers that you like, and it's usually good to get at least 2 or 3 to have a look at it, then you'll get the installation done. Typically that's quite fast if you're working with a big firm. They'll come and just make sure that the roof is all okay, and then they'll install all the panels, the batteries, and all that stuff. I got all of that done through a company called Project Solar, who are really good with me. And the thing for me is that I don't think that it's always worth going with the cheapest possible quote, because you really want that provider to exist for a long time. So you want a company that's kind of decent. You don't just want, Bob round the corner to come and do it, because these panels are going to last for about 30 years. So if something goes wrong, you kind of want somebody to fall back on. Once you've got it installed, unfortunately, that isn't the end of the story in terms of exporting, and there's usually about a 2-week period before you get the MCS certificate, which is what most energy providers will require for you to actually be able to export to them and get paid. The export will actually be set up, it'll just be going into the grid somewhere, but in order to actually get paid you need the MCS certificate, which is why it's important to go with an MCS registered installer. Otherwise, you won't actually be able to do that final step and get paid for the electricity that you're producing. It'll just be going to the grid for free. This can take about 2 weeks. That really annoyed me when I first started. It was in the middle of summer. I got mine done at the end of August, and I had all this sunlight pouring in, and I was sending kilowatts out to the grid and not getting paid for it at all, because you have to wait a while before this MCS certificate turns up. And meanwhile, you're giving it away to everybody for nothing. The final part of the process that I actually think is probably one of the single most important things that I didn't realize when I was first looking at getting solar was to change my tariff. Now, you will end up on a slightly different tariff, because you've got one tariff for the import and one tariff for the export. If you're a regular user of electricity, you'll just be on some kind of flat rate for the import, but you'll need a new tariff for the export, because you're going to get paid a certain amount, and that's either something flexible or something fixed. These two things are different, and there's different demands on the grid at different times. What I personally have gone for is Octopus Agile for the import, and I'm fixed on the export, because typically the 15p that you get for exporting, generally speaking, is much better than the rates that you get on Agile, because Agile is actually quite cheap generally. One thing that's useful to point out here is that I didn't realize beforehand just how reliant I was still going to be on the grid. In times where there's no sunlight, you're going to be drawing from the grid, and in times where there's tons of sunlight, you're going to be sending back to the grid. So you're actually a very active participant with the grid, more so than you might even have been before. This brings into question one important point, which is, well, what happens if there's a power cut? Well, unfortunately, with a standard solar setup, if there's a power cut, your panels actually turn off and stop working. So it's not like you're just going to be using the electricity internally within your house. because you're fundamentally connected to the grid, if there's something wrong with the power line, the solar panels need to turn off so they don't electrocute the poor electrician who's further down the cable trying to fix something. If you do want to be able to use your own solar power within your house, you actually have to pay more and get an electrician to set up a special box with an isolator, kind of breaker switch type thing, so it automatically trips and is only feeding internally when something happens to the electricity connection. I decided not to get this because we live in a fairly established town and the electricity connection is pretty solid. But if you are worried about that kind of stuff and you're really getting this for kind of like self-sustainability or something as well, then you might need to ask your electrician about this before they start the installation, because it probably will cost a bit more. So I've touched on these rates a little bit and these tariffs, which I do think is super, super important. And as I said, a standard user of electricity is just on a flat rate throughout the day. The energy company is basically calculating an average of what people use at what time and giving a flat rate so that you can use however much energy you want at any time, and it's going to be the same cost. In reality, this is not really what happens. In the morning, when people are getting ready for work, the price spikes up a little bit, then everybody goes to work and the price goes back down again. Around lunchtime, it comes up a little bit more, back down in the afternoon, and then between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock, everybody gets home, turns on the TV, puts on the kettle, starts using the oven, and all of this energy usage drives the price up massively. So between 4 and 7 o'clock is this special period within the timescale where the price is really expensive. And this usually is offset in the flat price by just the average between the two. You use quite a lot of energy in that expensive period, but because you don't use that much energy outside of that period, it ends up dragging the whole price up. If you've got solar panels and batteries though, the story is a little bit different. You don't need to use energy while the price is really expensive. So what you can do is move on to one of the more flexible tariffs. And again, this is where the smart meter comes in for this 30-minute pricing. And there are two tariffs. I'm going to focus on Octopus because that's what I know super well. I started off on a tariff called Octopus Flux. And this one is quite easy to get started with because there are only 3 bands. If you've ever heard of Economy 7 or used it yourself, you'll know that there's a period in the nighttime, which is much cheaper. And then the rest of the time in the day, it is more expensive. Flux works a little bit like that, except there are 3 bands. There's a cheap period in the night, there's a regular daytime price, and then there's an expensive period between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock. And the idea here is that you get your battery to turn on, you set it up in a specific way so that your battery turns on between 4 and 7 o'clock definitely, which means that when you're using the oven or anything, you're not using the electricity at the expensive price, you're using it from the battery instead. And as soon as 7 o'clock comes around, you can either carry on using the battery or turn the system off so that it goes back onto the grid again. That's really for the rest of the evening when there's no sun. Hopefully, the rest of the day, you will be getting power from your solar panels. This also depends on the time of year. The more complicated tariff, which is the one that I am on now, is Octopus Agile, and this price updates literally every 30 minutes. So you can see the real-time power usage in the United Kingdom basically as a forecast. And what happens is at 4 o'clock every day, Octopus publishes the following day's worth of rates from midnight through to the following midnight. And that happens at 4 p.m. every day. So you can see what the power price is going to be on the following day. And this is based on an auction where different power companies and power consumers all auction together in a centralized place. And then you get to see the result. The great thing about this is that you can tailor your battery to only be using power when it's really, really cheap. Otherwise, the rest of the time, you can actually just use a combination of solar and the grid. And what this typically does for Agile is this dramatically reduces the average cost of electricity from the grid when the solar is not enough to power your home, which will happen, especially in cases around the wintertime and things like that. The standard rate right now, if you're a regular energy user, is 24.5 pence per kilowatt hour for electricity. If you're on Agile, you could typically expect the average power price outside of the peak periods to be around 15 pence. So it is a really huge amount that has been taken off. It's about a third less. Not to mention that you're using some sun from your panels anyway to make electricity, but if you do need some extra, it's typically a lot cheaper because you're avoiding those horrible pricing periods and the energy company doesn't need to bring you up on an average anymore because you're now using your battery, which was filled up either from the sun directly or using cheap power from the grid. So this is one of the things that I really underestimated when I was getting solar. I didn't realize how much the tariff was going to affect the pricing. And even for a user who doesn't really get that much sun, dramatically affects the price that you're going to pay without actually doing that much with the system. It's kind of irrespective of the panels or the battery. So next up, let's talk a little bit about panel orientation, because this is something that I hadn't really appreciated before and kind of feeds into what we were just talking about tariffs and the way to just think about the whole system. Originally, when I was getting solar, I have a southwest facing roof, which is pretty good for this. But I figured originally, well, maybe it's better to have some on there and some on the roofs facing east and west, because that's going to get a more even power distribution through the day. If I have them all on the south facing roof, I'm going to get this big spike in the day that I'm just not going to be able to use. Well, that kind of way of thinking thinking just doesn't really make much sense in the context of exporting to the grid. Unless the power price that you're importing at is way, way higher than the export price, then it doesn't really make sense to do that, because you really don't care whether you're using energy from the grid at 15p or whether you're exporting to the grid at 15p, assuming those prices kind of stay around the same. So what you really want is just maximal solar gain at all times. Some of the money that you're going to spend on electricity from the grid in times where you're not getting as much sun is going to be offset by the amount of electricity that you export to the grid in the times where you have too much. So it's actually way better just to keep everything on that south-facing roof than it is to try and split it and get it across the day or whatever. Unless your goal specifically is to try to get as much internal use as possible for environmental reasons, which I can kind of see the argument there. But from a purely economic perspective, it's much better just to keep everything on the south-facing roof and just maximize that solar as much as you can to get as much back as you can on the export to offset the times that you do have to draw from the grid. I didn't really think about it in this way previously, and it kind of changed the way that I think about the whole solar setup that I've got. So on that basis, how often are we actually going to be using energy from the grid? It's a very, very good question, and it's something that also kind of surprised me too. Sun versus cloud, first off, is a very, very important thing. When you're pulling energy directly from the sun in the middle of the summer, you could be getting up to, on my system, the rated production that your panels will give out. Mine is nearly a 6 kilowatt system, and I could basically pull just under 6 kilowatts in the midday sun in the summer from this system. Unfortunately, as soon as the clouds come over onto my house, this can actually go down by 90% to 75%. It's really, really stark, the difference between having sun on the panels and having just ambient light. They do work in ambient light, but it is much less. We're going from something like 6 kilowatts being produced down to 1 kilowatt, maybe even 800 watts. So it's a lot smaller when it's in the shade. And this gets worse the thicker the clouds get. On some days in the autumn that we've had recently, the clouds have been so thick that the panels have barely worked at all and given me about 30 to 40 watts in some parts of the day. So it really is very dramatic, the difference between having sun or not, and this is why you end up still relying on the grid and why the import tariffs are still extremely important. The next question then is, well, summer versus winter, does that make a big difference? I've kind of alluded to the fact that it does. The sun is so much higher in the sky in the summer and so low in the winter, and you just get so many fewer daylight hours in the winter as well. Both of those things add up together to make a dramatic decrease in the winter. I've been tabulating the amount of sun that I get. As you can see here, I'll bring up the chart, and you can see my most productive month was in June, where we received 721 kilowatt hours in through the panels, versus the least productive month that we had, which was in January of 2024, which is 223. So this is, again, it's like a third to a quarter of the energy production that you can expect in the winter versus the summer. And this really changes how you think about your panels and how you're going to use your system. You'll be a net buyer of electricity during the winter season, and in the summer, you're going to be a net exporter. So this does have some ramifications for how you actually use the system. In the summer, it's very, very straightforward because most of your energy costs are just completely covered by the sun during the day, and you only have to worry about the battery at nighttime. Whereas in the winter, even the sunlight during the day possibly won't even cover the usage that you have. I'm quite a big user of electricity, and in the winter, it won't cover my working from home and using my computers and all of that stuff. So I have to be very careful about when I turn the battery on and off, because otherwise I might run out, and then I have to pay the peak prices in the 4 to 7 o'clock window. So it gets a bit complicated in the winter. So on to number 6, and this is a very important point about how much energy do things actually use anyway. Well, I've talked a little bit about watts and kilowatts, and this is sort of an instantaneous measure of power. When the sunlight is shining on the panels and they're producing, say, 4 kilowatts, devices also have this energy consumption power, of course. They have a kilowatt rating. But what is more important and what people tend to use is the kilowatt hour. So if you've got 4 kilowatts shining on a panel for an hour, that's 4 kilowatt hours of production of actual energy rather than it just being power. And so it really depends on the time that you've got these things on. So for example, you may put your oven on and you have that on for half an hour. That is a 3 kilowatt device, usually somewhere between 2 and 3. It kind of depends, but let's just say 3 for the time being. And you have that on for half an hour. Well, that's going to be 3 divided by 2. It's going to get you to 1.5 kilowatt hours of energy. And what you'll find is that when you look through the applications that you'll be given to monitor everything, because you can usually monitor stuff down to sort of the 5-minute interval, is that you'll see that devices that are involved with heat typically the most energy hungry. So that is the oven, that is the kettle, even though it's only short-lived. There's a lot of energy used in a short period of time, and definitely things like the tumble dryer. It depends on the type, but typical tumble dryers use a lot of energy. So anything that's heating up water or heating up air, cooking food, toasters, anything like that, anything that's heating is using a lot of electricity. And because they're also on for a long time, that has a massive disproportionate effect on how much electricity that they use. Once you find yourself monitoring these things, often you'll end up thinking, goodness me, how much electricity do these things things used, because previously you've not really had a good way of seeing it. This is one reason why I ended up changing over from using my tumble dryer most of the time over to a dehumidifier. It takes a lot longer, but it uses a lot less electricity. The tumble dryer can also be up to about 3 kilowatts, whereas a dehumidifier is more like 300 watts. So it would have to be on for 10 times as long as the tumble dryer before you end up losing out on electricity. So it's interesting seeing all these different devices. Now, one thing that is very interesting is just the background usage of your property. I didn't really think about this too much, but you've got fridges on, you've got routers, things on standby, like all of this kind of stuff, and that can actually be quite a lot. In my house, it typically averages at about 150 watts, and you can see this through the night when everybody's upstairs in bed and nothing's really on. But that ends up actually adding up. 150 watts all day for 24 hours ends up being 3.6 kilowatt hours, which is actually a lot of usage. It's a surprising amount that the house just uses on its own without even turning anything on. On the flip side, when you turn on energy-saving light bulbs, which most people have these days, you make sure you're not using incandescent bulbs. So long as you've got LEDs installed, you just won't even see them on the chart. It's inconsequential, really. Obviously, a good idea to turn them off over the long run, over the full year. It can make a small difference, but day to day, you're just not going to see the difference of you turning bulbs on and off in the house. It's just not even going to notice amongst the background noise of the fridges and freezers and that kind of thing. So obviously getting panels doesn't mean that you're never going to use electricity again because you're trying to export it all as much as you can to the grid. You've got to use these devices. So what we want to do is use them at the most optimal time that we can. So when do we want to use them? We usually want to use them overnight. This is typically when the rates are the cheapest, especially if you're on something like Agile. And when we got our dishwasher, I joked like, who needs a Wi-Fi connection to their dishwasher? Well, lo and behold, I didn't realize that when I was changing over to Octopus Agile, that I would indeed be using that every single night to turn it on at some time between 1 in the morning, 3 in the morning, or whatever, so that we use the cheap price overnight rather than using it in the day or using the sun that could be exported back to the grid, so long as it's cheaper than the export price, that is. So there's quite a lot of tweaking that you can do, and setting up timers and things on the various devices is well worth it if you've got solar, to try to take advantage of these tariffs as much as you can. It's something that's definitely worth thinking about. So number 8, onto the battery. Is it worth it? I think this question is really tricky. It kind of depends on how you want to use your system. What it really does, let's think about what the battery actually does for you. The battery saves you from using electricity when the prices are really high, typically between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock. So it saves you from using the prices during that time period, and can either be charged up using the sun directly in the day, or it can be charged up overnight from the grid when the prices are low. So you're making the difference between the cheap grid price and the price at 4 p.m. This makes a big difference if you're cooking every night, say, and you don't really have much flexibility. I have 2 kids, and so we don't have much flex about when we can make our dinner. If the price is really going to be a lot, then you can maybe make something different and avoid using the oven, but typically we just end up using it every day. So the battery, I think, was probably worth it for us, but it's tricky because they are actually really quite expensive, and they also have a lifespan on them as well, something like 10 to 15 years, depending on how much you use them. The one thing that it does do, though, is it gives you peace of mind so that you won't be using those rates when it's really, really expensive, so long as you can manage the power consumption correctly and you have it set up so that you'll have something available when it comes to 4 o'clock. So I think it is worth it for some people in that way. And you can also take advantage of prices when they are very, very low by charging your battery and doing other stuff as well. The final part in this, which is critical, is the applications. I have a Solax inverter, so I have the Solax software and have their portal, and it's fascinating what you can actually see. As I said before, you've got this 5-minute time interval where you can see how much you're sending to the grid, how much the house is using, how much the panels are using, what the battery charge level is, and how much is coming in and out of the battery. And you can watch all of this stuff as it happens with probably a 10-minute delay at about 5-minute interval to figure out what is going on. And this gleans so many of the insights that I've understood over the past year and a bit after installing the panels themselves, and it's really important. The other part that's super important to understand is how to actually use the system to get the things that you want to do out of it, such as how do you force charge the battery between certain times, how do you make sure that the battery is exporting at times that are actually beneficial, and it wouldn't be better to get energy from the grid, for example, when power can get really, really cheap, even down to 0 and maybe negative. And some people even go a step further and start automating everything using an application called Home Assistant. I'm not quite at that stage yet, but I hope to do that at some point. So there is so much more still to cover about solar. I'm actually intending on putting quite a few more videos out about solar panels. This whole channel is going to be more broader finance, but to begin with, we're looking at solar specifically because it's the latest project that I've been undertaking within my personal finance sort of realm. So if you want to see more videos like that, then please do subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.